On average, there are 27 wide receivers a week that score at least 10 fantasy points. However, 2 of the last 3 weeks have resulted in over 30 wide receivers scoring over 10 fantasy points. This week, though, I would not be surprised if we see 40 wide receivers hit that mark. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Today we're talking about the wide receivers we're going to start and sit here in Week 11 fantasy football. Now, like in all of our other shows, there are timestamps down below in the description if that's what you're looking for. But if I can have your attention here for just a minute or two, I gotta continue trying to make the world a better place here. Now, you know, in this show, every single week, we do our best to try to get some children sponsored through Compassion International. So far on the year, we've had 8 children sponsored on our way to our goal of 58 kids sponsored by Super Bowl 58. We're doing a great job here, and I greatly appreciate the support of the community, but you better believe we have 2 more Compassion Kids of the Week here that are just looking for a little bit of your help. So let's go ahead and take a look at who are the 2 Compassion Kids of the Week here in Week 11. Up first, it's little Landa. She's 5 years old, currently lives in Haiti, and has been waiting for a sponsor for 355 days. Secondly, we got little Emmanuel, 1 year old, living in Uganda, waiting for a sponsor for 337 days. Is there anyone out there in Headliner Nation that is able to help 1 or 2 of these children before the holiday season? We are trying so hard to get as many kids sponsored as we can here before the holiday season. Let's give them something to look forward to. So if you are able to help, there's a link down below in the description. You see it right here on the screen. It's compassion.com/headliners. Now, when you go to that site, you'll see our logo up there in the top right-hand corner. You also saw a child ID on each one of the pictures that we threw up on the screen. You can actually search for that child's ID right there on that homepage. Now, if you go through that process and you search for a child and that child is no longer available, that's not a bad thing. That is a great thing. That child is on its way to escaping extreme poverty. But there are still thousands of other kids available right now that need our help. So like I said, if there's anyone out there in the community that is able to help us change the world one child at a time, it's www.compassion.com/headliners. But thank you so much for once again giving me a couple minutes there to discuss that each and every week. This is something I'm very dedicated in trying to do and trying to help make a little. I know it's not going to change the entire world, but if we can change one life at a time, it's totally worth it to me. But now it's time to dive into some football. I know that's why so many of you are here. So let's kick it off Thursday night with actually a good game here this week, the Cincinnati Bengals and Baltimore Ravens. And I know there were a lot of sphincters that all relaxed when Ja'Marr Chase was able to play last week. Not only just play, but produce over 20 fantasy points. Now his role, yeah, it was lesser than usual. Both Tyler Boyd and Tanner Hudson saw more targets last week than Ja'Marr Chase did, but this week is lining up to be a lot of the same. Now Ja'Marr Chase, he looks good to go, but news has already come out that T. Higgins is doubtful to play here in a short week, which means we're firing up Tyler Boyd once again. It's a tough matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow only 23.4 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 8th fewest in the NFL. Now, these two teams faced off back in week 2. No other wide receiver in Cincinnati found success in that game aside from T. Higgins. So it's obviously fitting that T. Higgins won't be playing here this week. Now, we all know each and every week that Ja'Marr Chase is an absolute must-start guy, but really not a top 5 guy for me here this week, more of a top 12 to 15 option in this difficult matchup. Now, Tyler Boyd, he kind of has to be in the top 30 to 35, right? It's just too big of an opportunity to not have him that high. He saw 12 targets last week, and this team in Cincinnati doesn't have a whole lot of depth at the wide receiver position. Boyd may not have the touchdown upside of a Ja'Marr Chase, but he is definitely somebody with some flex value here in Week 11. But what about Baltimore? And really, it's only Zay Flowers for the most part, even though his production has even suffered over the last month or so of the season, because Baltimore isn't throwing the ball a ton. In fact, Zay Flowers has 11 catches for 103 yards and no touchdowns over his last 3 games combined, and he hasn't seen over 7 targets in a game in over a month. Now, he went over 7 targets in 4 of the first 6 games this season. But what about Odell Beckham? He's got touchdowns now in back-to-back ball games. Kind of said that was coming at some point, right? But even he has only 6 catches for 96 total yards over the last 3 games combined. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow 28.4 fantasy points per game. Kind of a middle-of-the-pack defense as far as opposing wide receivers go. Now, Odell Beckham himself, he's on the injury report right now, but that could be a little bit more of a veteran rest type situation. Mostly, the Baltimore secondary is what's a little bit banged up right now. If I was going to start any wide receiver in Baltimore, it's going to be Zay Flowers. But even he hasn't scored over 10 fantasy points in a game since week 6, and he's only done it twice all year. Really more of just a wide receiver 3, a top 36 guy at this point. But now we're going to mosey on over to some Sunday football. Let's talk about the Dallas Cowboys and Carolina Panthers, and we'll kick it off with Dallas because CeeDee Lamb right now is holy crap hot in fantasy football. The last 3 straight games, at least 11 catches and 150 yards receiving in all of them. He's scored at least 15 fantasy points now in 4 straight ball games, and he's about as must-start as it gets here right now. But now all of a sudden, Brandon Cooks is starting to get a little bit more of an opportunity in this offense? Or is he? I mean, not really. Everyone's going to look at the box scores from week 10 and see 173 yards receiving and 1 touchdown and automatically think this guy is some must-start wide receiver as well. But that's just not the case. He's really benefited from touchdowns here as of late. Sure, there was a big number there in week 10, but that is a massive outlier when you look at every single game he's played this season. He's a guy that's hovering right around 3 or 4 catches a week. He's not out there getting double-digit targets in each and every game. Somebody with a safer floor. He's a little bit more boom or bust because if he goes out there and we know he's not going to have one of those huge games each and every week, he becomes very touchdown dependent. He doesn't score, more than likely you're disappointed. Maybe he's someone we can look at in decent matchups. I just don't know if that's this matchup here against Carolina. They allow the 3rd fewest points to opposing wide receivers in the NFL, and they're about to get defensive back J.C. Horn back from the IR. Now, if you watch this offseason, you know exactly why CeeDee Lamb is dominating right now, because we talk about it almost every offseason. It has to do with slot snaps. He is an immediate defensive mismatch every time you put him in the slot, and he lines up in the slot all the time. Right now, he has the 6th most slot snaps in the NFL. Now, I don't want to call the guy matchup proof, but with the way he's playing, I don't care about this matchup against Carolina. He's obviously going to be a start. As for Brandon Cooks, a little bit more touchdown dependent. Do I want to count on a touchdown in a matchup like this? Probably not. He's definitely more boom or bust, a flex play at best in deeper leagues. But now we'll go down to Carolina, and really the only option to talk about is going to be Adam Thielen. He's the only one worth considering in Carolina. Bryce Young just doesn't look anywhere else enough to warrant it. Thielen, though, has kind of struggled over the last couple weeks of the season. Back-to-back games now with single-digit fantasy points. But right now, he's number 2 in the NFL when it comes to slot snaps. That's where he's found a lot of his success already this season. That's why he's going to continue to be somebody we look at each week as a starting option in fantasy football. We're chasing the volume, right? We can't score fantasy points if we're not touching the football. At the wide receiver position, you need targets to get touches. But I'm not oblivious to the fact that Dallas isn't an easy matchup for them in Carolina. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but Hayden Hurst, Laviska Shenault, and DJ Chark are all questionable to play here this week. They're not 100% healthy. Who is 100% healthy? Adam freaking Thielen right now. The biggest thing to watch in this ballgame is can that Carolina offensive line keep the pass rush of the Dallas Cowboys at bay long enough just for a receiver to run a resemblance of a route. I expect a whole lot of quick reads and the ball out of the hands of Bryce Young super fast here this week. That definitely benefits the likes of Adam Thielen once again here in week 11. Easily could rack up double-digit targets, and even though the ceiling may be a little bit lower this week, he's definitely somebody, especially in PPR formats, that can provide you a safe floor here once again. But how about we go out to Cleveland for the Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers? We'll kick it off in Pittsburgh, and now Kenny Pickett has figured out some way to kill the consistency of both George Pickens and now Deontay Johnson as well. These two combined for 4 catches for 62 yards in week 10. That ain't gonna cut it. There were 5 pass catchers in Pittsburgh this last week that all saw 4 targets. They all tied for the team lead. But I think even Pittsburgh is starting to realize what they have with Kenny Pickett. I mean, he's basically Mitch Trubisky with longer blonde hair. Pickens over his last 3 games has a total of 6 catches for 66 yards. How can you justify starting a wide receiver that's putting up numbers like that? What about Deontay Johnson last week? 1 catch for 17 yards after what he did in week 9? I mean, that floor is ridiculously low. Now a matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow 21.4 fantasy points per game. That is 3rd fewest to opposing wide receivers. Now, these two faced off back in week 2. In that game, Deontay Johnson didn't play, but George Pickens did. Had 10 targets, 4 receptions, 127 yards, and a touchdown. Really benefited from a 71-yard touchdown in that game. But Pittsburgh has gone heavy run. They know that Kenny Pickett can't take them to the promised land, so let's try to play good defense and run the football. 3 of their last 4 games have resulted in less than 25 pass attempts in each game. Both of these wide receivers have a super high ceiling. The problem is their floor is crazy low here as of late. If I had to pick one of these guys, it's still going to be Diontae Johnson. I think he's closer to getting more consistent volume than that of George Pickens. But even Diontae Johnson himself may not even make it inside my top 30 this week in this matchup. How crazy is it? All you got to do is get Pickens 8 targets a week and the dude's going to put up numbers, and they can't seem to do it. Absolutely mind-blowing. What about Cleveland, though? It's Amari Cooper, and he is for sure an option here in Week 11. The dude has had at least 11 fantasy points now in 4 of his last 5 ball games, and is all the way up to wide receiver 19 overall on the season, and climbing super fast. He's by far, and it's not even close, the #1 receiving option in this offense. Now, Elijah Moore, he hasn't had more than 44 yards receiving in a game in 3 weeks, and even though he just had a touchdown, that was his first one of the season, so we're not seeing very many of those. We strive. I'm talking about strive to find wide receivers that can score you 10 fantasy points a week without needing a touchdown in order to do it. Amari Cooper is on the verge of being right there. Now a matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In their last meeting back in week 2, Cooper had 10 targets, 7 receptions for 90 yards. Another 12.5-point fantasy football day. He's just a solid wide receiver too. There's no reason to overhype him. There's no reason to discount what it is that he has done. He's going to be right around 10, 11 fantasy points week in, week out, with the occasional big game when he scores a touchdown. He's definitely going to be inside my top 24 this week. All right, down to the Lions and Bears now. We'll kick it off right here in Chicago because we got some news that just came out here today. It sounds like Justin Fields is going to start here in Week 11, and that is a great thing because Tyson Bagent, even though he isn't horrible, he really made DJ Moore hard to start. Moore hasn't had over 58 yards receiving in a game since Week 5. His catch percentage went from the 80s down to the 60s. The Bears as a team, they haven't been scoring very much. They haven't scored over 17 points in the last 3 weeks. DJ Moore's yards per target have gone from like right around 14 plus down to 8. It just makes him super hard to start weekly when Tyson Bagent is under center. So now I'm glad we're going to get Justin Fields back in a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So a decent matchup. And this is a matchup of 2 solid run defenses as well. They're going to have to throw the ball. And with Detroit being a top 5 offense, you better believe the Bears are going to have to keep their foot on the pedal and try to keep pace with them. There's going to be a lot of throwing that needs to happen. Honestly, I'm glad that we have Justin Fields back for this matchup. It's definitely going to move DJ Moore back at my rankings here slightly. But all right, how about Amon-Ra and the Lions now? And this kid is must-start AF at this point. Over 100 yards receiving now in 6 of his last 7 ball games, averaging over 10 targets a game, and career highs in every other receiving category. No other wide receiver here in Detroit either is even remotely close to Amon-Ra, and that's why we're really not considering anyone else. At this point of the season, Amon-Ra has 87 targets and 65 receptions. The next closest wide receiver is Josh Reynolds, and he only has 35 targets and 24 receptions. It's the running game, the running backs, Sam Laporta, and a whole lot of Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now a matchup going up against Chicago. They allow 27.5 fantasy points per game. Kind of a middle-of-the-pack pass defense. We're still waiting to find out whether or not Donovan Peoples-Jones, who was acquired from Cleveland here not that long ago, makes it into the lineup this week or not. How does he affect this offense? Does he really? I don't think it even matters. This is Amon-Ra's team when it comes to pass-catching volume. Now, I know y'all probably saw the post as well. Jamison Williams out there putting McFlurries on double cheeseburgers, looking disgusting. Dude is not an option when it comes to fantasy football. It's Amon-Ra or nothing. He's the wide receiver that we want each and every week in Detroit. But now we'll head up to Green Bay for the Packers, and the Chargers will kick it off in LA. And the only thing that can stop Keenan Allen at this point is probably an injury. Let's just hope whatever he suffered in week 10 is something he can continue to play through, because he absolutely once again put the offense on his back last week. 14 targets, 11 catches, 175 yards, and 2 tutties. Thank you very much, Keenan Allen. After that performance, he's all the way up to wide receiver 3 on the season and only 1.4 fantasy points behind A.J. Brown here this year. He's just another guy who's dominating because of the snaps out of the slot. 5th most in the NFL, top 10 in the NFL in targets, receptions, receiving yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per route run. This guy right now is absolutely unstoppable, but now they get a matchup going up against Green Bay. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But like I mentioned here at the beginning, he was banged up in week 10. Now, nothing has come out with a specific injury, but he is currently on the injury report and questionable to play this week alongside Gerald Everett. And then don't forget, Josh Palmer is still on IR as well. He's definitely an injury we're paying close attention to here rest of week, though, because we definitely want him in our fantasy football lineups because it really all comes down to health, right? If Keenan Allen is healthy, he is a must-start wide receiver. Now, the other guys in this offense, like Jalen Guyton or Quentin Johnston, they just don't see enough volume to start them weekly. They are highly touchdown dependent, and I would prefer to start them in better matchups, not one like this against a very difficult Green Bay secondary. How about those wide receivers in Green Bay? Now, this offense gives me no warm fuzzies at all here in 2023. No wide receiver can get consistent volume. Dobbs, he continues getting those touchdown opportunities. He's had a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games he's played. What about Jayden Reed? He's only seeing right around 4 targets a week, but he's getting more yards than Dobbs. Christian Watson, he hasn't had more than 3 catches in a game all season, and Dontavian Wicks is out there getting the same amount of volume as the other 3 wide receivers I just named. Now, because none of these guys are getting huge volume, we need touchdowns. Now, at this point, I'm putting Jayden Reed over Christian Watson. Watson hasn't done anything all season long for me to look at him and be like, you know what? We got something here. But I do see that with Jayden Reed way more often, especially in a great matchup like this going up against the Chargers. They allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This matchup, in my opinion, is just too good to not take a risk on. If you're looking for the safer of all the risks, it's probably Romeo Doubs due to that touchdown stability that we've seen here over the last month of the season. But that risky side of me, that one that really wants to try to find the guy who has the best overall game this week, I'm going with Jayden Reed in a breakout game. How about Arizona and Houston now for the Cardinals? I know there's a lot of people out there that expected a lot more from Hollywood Brown last week with the return of Kyler Murray in week 10. But it was Kyler Murray's first game back. You have to expect there's a little bit of rust there. And I don't know if you watched the game or not, but they missed a huge touchdown by inches. Kyler put it in the back of the end zone. It landed in the hands of a fully extended Marquise Hollywood Brown, and when he hit the ground, it popped out. It would have been a great catch, but they just missed it. Better days are definitely coming for sure there in Arizona for those two, though. But we also have to accept the fact that Trey McBride, Rondale Moore, even Michael Wilson, they're all going to get looks in this offense. Hollywood isn't going to ever be one of those guys that sees 10-plus targets every single week. He needs big plays, and he needs good matchups. A matchup this week going up against Houston, they allow 25.4 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's a little less than average. This is going to be a little bit more of a challenge this week for Kyler Murray as well. And I say that because we've seen this Houston offense put up some big offensive numbers here in the past few weeks, which means Kyler Murray is going to have to be efficient and successful on offense all 4 quarters. Arizona is going to need to score 20-plus points in this game to have a chance at winning. No wide receiver here in Arizona is going to be safe, but if I had to lean one, it's still the connection between Kyler Murray and Marquise Hollywood Brown. How about for Houston? And we have what I would like to call a cornucopia of options here when it comes to the wide receiver position. We may get Nico Collins back this week. We do not know at the time of this recording. But we also have Tank Dell and Noah Brown, who just showed last week that he wasn't some one-hit wonder in this offense with no Nico Collins. Now, with it being the middle of the week and Nico still being questionable, I have to look at this matchup and say that Tank Dell and Noah Brown at this time are probably going to be a little bit safer going forward in this matchup. It's Houston and Arizona. This isn't some difficult matchup for the Houston Texans. The Cardinals allow 27.7 fantasy points per game, right around league average to opposing wide receivers. They may not need 100% healthy Nico Collins out there if they're getting the production with the other 2 guys. So I would not be surprised that even if he does play, he doesn't see a full set of snaps. So as of right now, this is how I'm ranking these 3 guys in Houston. It's Tank Dell, then Noah Brown, then Nico Collins. If anything, it's this injury to Nico Collins that has forced the hand of the Houston Texans to give more volume weekly to Tank Dell. That's all he was missing, was consistent volume. And now with double-digit targets in back-to-back games, he's obviously a guy that you want to start each week in fantasy football. Now, can we expect huge blow-up games every single week from Noah Brown? No, probably not, and especially not if Nico Collins returns. Those two guys will definitely eat into each other's ceiling. However, if Nico were to sit again, then once again, Noah Brown becomes a flex option here in week 11. Which will now take us down to Jacksonville for the Jags and the Titans. And how long ago does it seem since we had that huge DeAndre Hopkins 3-touchdown game? It's because since then, he hasn't done squat. 87 yards receiving in the last 2 games combined and a catch rate of only 37%. Damn, that is bad. The targets are there, so that's good. They're just not overly catchable at this point for DeAndre Hopkins. Now, Kyle Phillips, that's another name to somewhat pay attention to. He's actually been their leading receiver over the last 2 games. However, over those last 2 weeks, he's only averaging right around 3 or 4 catches a game for right around 65 yards or so. So really not a fantasy option himself. But now they get a matchup going up against Jacksonville, and they allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they just got annihilated last week by San Francisco. Now, Treylon Burks, he's still questionable to play, but he's really a non-factor overall in this offense. This is a great chance for DeAndre Hopkins to bounce back and have another super solid game. But so were his last 2 games against Pittsburgh and Tampa Bay. He's falling down the rankings, and for me, he's no higher than a low-end wide receiver 2 for me here this week. What about Jacksonville? I really wish I knew what Christian Kirk had on Trevor Lawrence. He's got to have something, right? Because he's literally the only wide receiver that Trevor Lawrence looks for deep down the field. I mean, I get it, right? Calvin Diddley ain't done much of anything all year long. But how does Evan Ingram have 4 receptions for 12 yards in a ball game? That makes no sense. Christian Kirk is consistently averaging over 10 yards per reception. Everyone else is like in the firm single digits. Not that I hate it for Christian Kirk, right? This is why we liked him still this offseason. But how did this offense turn into one that can only support 1 wide receiver a week? It makes no sense. Now a matchup going up against Tennessee. They allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This is another good matchup for the receivers of Jacksonville. Overall, this team is fairly healthy. Probably going to continue to be without Zay Jones considering he just got out of jail. But really nothing else changes in Jacksonville here this week. It's the same thing we've been saying week after week after week. It's roll out Christian Kirk. He's the safest option in this offense. Keep Ridley on your bench. At some point, he's going to go off and have a crap ton of points on your bench, but you have no idea when that's going to happen, and his production over the last 10 weeks of the season is nowhere near consistent enough to want to trust him in your fantasy lineup. All right, now we go down to Miami. For the Raiders and the Dolphins, we'll kick it off with Las Vegas because I absolutely love to see all the volume going the way of Davante Adams. What I don't love to see is how much of it is uncatchable. He hasn't caught more than 58% of his targets in a game since week 5. Over his last 3 games played, 27 targets, only 11 receptions. He has no touchdowns since week 3 and has only broken 80 yards receiving 3 times all year long. Now, Jacoby Myers, on the other hand, his volume has just died off. Over the last 3 games combined for him, 8 total targets for 78 total receiving yards. That just ain't going to cut it in fantasy lineups. Now a matchup going up against Miami. They allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This team in Las Vegas has turned things around. I think we can all see that. But they've really turned into a heavy run team and a team that wants to win on defense. It is really hard to sit Davante Adams due to the volume that he is seeing, but he's more of a top 20 wide receiver instead of a top 10 wide receiver these days. Now, sure, at some point, I kind of hope they make this connection a little bit better between Davante Adams and Aiden O'Connell, but for right now, we're just tempering expectations. But what about the wide receivers for Miami? It's great to have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle back off their bye week. Miami had an extra week to prep for this game, and when they're at home, they just play better. That's just the way it is in Miami. Now, Tyreek Hill, we know he's an automatic must start. He has touchdowns in all but 2 games this season and almost 20 fantasy points more than the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football, which is A.J. Brown. Now, a couple weeks ago, Jalen Waddle started to gain some traction here in this offense. Then that international game came against Kansas City and all his momentum went in the crapper. However, he still has 3 touchdowns over his last 5 games played, and he's averaging 9 targets a game over his last 5 games as well. So that's definitely a good sign moving forward. But now a matchup going up against Las Vegas isn't as easy as it sounds. They allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Plus, there's a chance that we're nearing the return of Devon Achane. And we know when Devon Achane's going off, that's just less opportunities for the pass catchers in Miami. However, it was a good sign that Jalen Waddle did come out here after the bye and say, listen, that bye week came at a great time. It gave me an opportunity to get 100% healthy. So we're going to stick with what we've been saying all year long here in Miami. It makes the most sense from a fantasy perspective. When all the top weapons in Miami are healthy, if you own them, they're in your fantasy lineups. Their ceilings are too high. Their ceilings are matchup winning. And I don't know about you, but I like winning matchups. Now, sure, sometimes it's hard for all of them to go off in the same game, but when you have a team who's kind of struggled here as of late coming off the bye week, they're going to want to build momentum to make a playoff run, and what a better way to do it than throwing the ball down the field to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Which will then take us up to Washington for the Commandos and the Giants, and we'll start off in New York because this one's easy. We ain't doing it. We're just not. No one in New York has done anything all year long, and they're going to continue to not do anything with Tommy DeVito as their quarterback. Even though this is an absolutely amazing matchup for them, I'm not interested. All the wide receivers in New York combined have one game all season long where they finished inside the top 24 at the wide receiver position. This is not even worth the fantasy debate. Not happening. How about Washington? And for me, I really don't understand why Washington continues to go out there week after week and overthink it. Jahan Dotson had great back-to-back games coming into week 10 while Curtis Samuel was hurt. Then week 10 comes, Dotson plays 95% of the snaps, the most he's played all season long. 2 targets, no catches, no yards. That's probably because Terry McLaurin got it all right. Terry McLaurin, 87% of the snaps, 8 targets, 4 catches for 33 yards. Okay, man, maybe they went right back to Curtis Samuel, right? Coming off the injury, they fed him, right? 6 targets, 2 catches, 6 yards. But Sam Howell threw for over 300 yards. Who the hell had all the yards? It was the Washington running backs, Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson Jr. combined for 161 yards receiving. No wonder Washington lost again. They couldn't figure out how to throw the ball down the field to their best wide receivers. Once again, it's like a broken record in Washington. Now they get a matchup going up against the Giants. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This is another great opportunity for great production from the wide receivers in Washington. But how is Washington going to screw this one up? Because you know they're going to. I've said this before, but I'm really starting to rethink what I've said in the past. I have never ever claimed to know more than an NFL head coach. But there are still a handful out there that can't call plays for crap. They're too busy being stuck on a bunch of stuff that just doesn't work. Let it go. Adapt. Overcome. Think of new concepts. All you're doing is the same boring crap each and every week. And when it doesn't work each and every week, change it up. But like I said, this is a matchup we want to start wide receivers in, right? We look at this matchup and be like, yeah, this is where we definitely want to fire up Terry McLaurin. This is where we definitely want to fire up Jahan Dotson. But there is no way of knowing which option is best here in Washington. The most consistent option here on the season is still Terry McLaurin. So let's cross our fingers and just hope for the best. If I had to go with my next option here, it's probably Curtis Samuel. Every time he's on the field, he seems to be among the team leaders in targets. Jahan Dotson just disappears when Curtis Samuel is on the field, and for that reason, that's why Samuel will be my second option here in this game if I had to pick. Which will now take us out to San Francisco for the 49ers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, my Manscaped matchup of the week. You gotta do me a favor. As soon as this video is over, head over to manscaped.com and check out the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. The lawnmower was already freaking amazing, but now it's coming with an interchangeable shaver head. You gotta go check it out. The holidays are right around the corner, and I guarantee somebody in your life could use one of these. But whatever you do, don't pay full price for it. Head over to manscaped.com, use the referral code Headliners at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Now for Tampa Bay, the Mike Evans train just keeps on chugging along. I felt a little bit spicy last week in week 10. I said, you know what? I'm going to put Mike Evans all the way up at wide receiver 5. Some people didn't really agree with it, which is cool, but then the dude went out and had 6 catches for 143 yards and a touchdown and finished as wide receiver 5. He's currently the wide receiver 9 overall on the season and has had over 10 fantasy points now in 4 straight ball games. When it comes to Chris Godwin, he wasn't feeling 100% in week 10, but really, his production was on par with what he's been doing all season long. Just a little bit more of a complimentary role here week in and week out in Tampa Bay. He's going to hover right around 7 to 10 fantasy points a week with the occasional touchdown. Kind of a bye week fill-in, an injury replacement type guy on your fantasy football team, but now a matchup going up against San Francisco. They allowed the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but don't tell that to the Jacksonville Jaguars because they couldn't do anything against them last week, and really it has everything to do with the San Francisco pass rush. The addition of Chase Young to this team, paired up with Nick Bosa, is an absolute quarterback nightmare. They're getting in the backfield super quick, and routes can't develop down the field because quarterbacks have no time in the pocket. A lot of those deeper routes down the field that we like to see from Mike Evans week in and week out, they may not be there this week. Baker may not have enough time in the pocket to allow the routes to get that deep. Evans isn't nearly as safe this week as he was last week. His volume probably going to be a little bit lower, which means we need a touchdown. Now, Mike Evans has one of the highest touchdown upsides of all wide receivers in fantasy football, and for that reason, I probably still put him in my lineup here this week. As for Chris Godwin, more of a flex play at best, hopefully in a PPR situation. If Baker gets in trouble and needs to bail out early, Chris Godwin could rack up a bunch of short receptions. But what about the guys in San Francisco? You can just see the confidence in this overall offense when everyone is fully healthy. CMC had almost 150 total yards, touchdowns for Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and George Kittle, and opposing defenses just can't contain all of these guys when they're healthy. Deebo once again getting some work on the ground and through the air, but Brandon Ayuk continues to be the guy deep down the field for Brock Purdy. In 3 of his last 4 games, Brandon Ayuk has averaged over 18 yards per reception, and that is huge, because when you have an offense that has this many weapons, he may not see huge volume. He's not a 10-plus target a week type of guy. But when you're averaging that many yards per reception with the amount of touchdowns in this overall offense, he doesn't need huge volume. There are very few wide receivers in fantasy football that we can say that about, but Brandon Ayuk is definitely one of them. Now a matchup going up against Tampa Bay. They allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This is lining up to be another good matchup for these guys in San Francisco. Both of these teams are a lot easier to throw on than they are to run on, but similar to what I said in Miami, when the top weapons in San Francisco are healthy, you have to try to find ways to put them into your lineups. Last week was a perfect example of how all of these guys can coexist each and every week. Now, is it going to happen every single game? Probably not, but in matchups like this, I'm willing to take that chance. Which will now take us down to Buffalo for the rematch of the New York Jets and Buffalo Bills, that game in week 1 where we saw Aaron Rodgers go down and the Jets win. A lot has happened since then, but let's go ahead and start off here with the Jets and Garrett Wilson, because he's the only one even worth talking about in New York, and he tries to do whatever he can weekly to help will his team to victory, sacrificing his body almost every single play, it feels like. But he's had 12-plus targets, 8-plus receptions, and 80-plus receiving yards now in 4 straight ball games. The only thing missing is touchdowns, and we know that the Jets don't score a lot of points. They're the 3rd lowest scoring team overall in the NFL, and that's what really kills the overall ceiling of Garrett Wilson. But it's not like he's just not startable in fantasy football. He's still putting up 11 fantasy points per game just due to the volume he's receiving alone. But now they get a matchup going up against Buffalo. They allow the 18th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and their defense is pretty banged up right now. I'm kind of hoping Garrett Wilson can heal up a little bit here this week, because he took an absolute beating in week 10. If you watch the end of that game, there's a Hail Mary last play of the game. He came down hard even on that play. He was limping around the field before that. Dude needs to heal up, rest up a little bit, because we would love to have him as a flex option here in week 11. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about way earlier in the show with Amari Cooper. We love to find those wide receivers that can score you 10 fantasy points each and every week without needing a touchdown to do it. That way, when they score a touchdown, you get a huge game, but if they don't overly hurt your fantasy lineup. Garrett Wilson is another perfect example of one of those wide receivers and why I have no issues flexing him at least each and every week. Okay, what about Buffalo? A lot has happened in Buffalo, and maybe Ken Dorsey took the fall here, But there's a lot more issues in Buffalo than just that. Josh Allen is in his own head way too much right now. He's overthinking things, trying to force things down the field. He's so worried about turnovers, he's not playing confident at all. It led to Stefon Diggs having his worst game of the season in Week 10 against Denver. A season low in targets, catches, and yards. Can we really sit Stefon Diggs, though? I really don't think we can. He's one of the best wide receivers in football, but hopefully this change in offense now just force feeds him the ball for a couple weeks to try to regain some of that confidence that Josh Allen has lost. Not the best matchup to do it in, though, going up against the Jets. They allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in the league, but when these two teams faced off back in Week 1, Stefon Diggs had 13 targets, 10 receptions, 102 yards, and a touchdown. Gabe Davis in that game, 2 catches for 32 yards. Typical Gabe Davis type of day. But overall, this offense is fairly healthy, and like I just said, there's no way you can sit Stefon Diggs, especially since he's proven to produce in matchups like this before this season. When it comes to Gabe Davis, though, he remains 154% boom or bust. He's one of those guys that you have to start or sit at your own risk, right? Because you have no idea what to expect from him. His consistency is all over the board. He is absolutely impossible to nail on a weekly basis because you have no idea how much they're going to include him. He is one of those guys, though, that if you take a chance and he pops off, he probably wins you your matchup. Which will now bring us out to LA for the Rams and the Seattle Seahawks. And for Seattle, boy, I love to see Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf both get double-digit targets in the same game. That is not something we have seen very often this season. But was it because of the matchup against Washington and their horrendous defense? It really probably was. The biggest problem here in Seattle is nothing is consistent week in and week out. DK Metcalf's fantasy point production over the last few weeks is like this: 9 points, 9 points, 5 points, 13 points. Tyler Lockett, not much better. 5 points, 18 points, 4 points, 19 points. It's all over the place and totally hit or miss. I guess if you want to look at both of those guys, DK has been a little bit more consistent, but doesn't have the ceiling of a Tyler Lockett. And now they get a matchup going up against the Rams on the road in LA. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They faced off back in Week 1. In that game, DK Metcalf had 3 catches for 47 yards and a touchdown. Lockett, 2 catches, 10 yards. Not a whole lot of production there from either one of them. It's really all because of Jackson Smith and Jigba. Now, no, he's not out there killing it for Seattle, but he's taking just enough volume to really hurt the overall consistency and ceiling of both DK and Tyler Lockett week in and week out. Now, JSN himself not doing enough to be fantasy startable each and every week, but when you look at this trio of wide receivers, it's enough to give you a bald spot weekly. If I had to rank them, I still go DK, Lockett, JSN in that order, but the distance between them is not very far. Now, for the Rams, praise to all things fantasy that it sounds like we're going to have Matthew Stafford at quarterback still for the Rams here this week. He suffered that injury prior to the bye. A lot of people expected him to miss some time. They even went out and signed Carson Wentz, but it sounds like we're going to have Matthew Stafford. And that's a big boost to Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, even though neither one of those guys are overly killing it consistently right now. Cooper Kupp has 3 straight games with less than 50 yards receiving. Puka, he's only gone over 50 yards receiving 1 out of his last 3 games as well. But they're coming off the bye week, and it's a great time for them to hit the reset button, especially against a matchup going up against Seattle, who allows the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And don't forget what Puka did to them back in Week 1. 15 targets, 10 catches, 119 yards. We're really not going to sit either one of these guys, right? I don't think anyone out there is going to sit Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua here in Week 11. But where we used to look at these guys as 2 potential top 12 wide receivers weekly, I think we need to slow our roll a little bit, and maybe they're 2 top 25 options for us here this week. Out to Denver now for the Broncos, and the Minnesota Vikings will kick it off in Minnesota. And the only thing that really people want to know here is the availability of Justin Jefferson. Unfortunately, we're still kind of in a holding pattern. They want to put him through some practice here this week and see how he responds. They have to be smart now in Minnesota. When he went down and when Kirk Cousins went down, I don't think they expected to keep winning ball games. But Josh Dobbs showed up, and all of a sudden, the Minnesota Vikings are like a game out of first place in their division. they definitely have a shot at the playoffs, so they do not want to rush back Justin Jefferson. They don't want to rush the return of Justin Jefferson now. They need him for the stretch run. But I think we all know by this point, if Justin Jefferson is fully healthy and in the lineup, he's probably starting for us in fantasy football. So let's just focus on Jordan Addison here just a little bit. His ceiling for sure has dropped with Josh Dobbs. He's had right around 8 fantasy points now in back-to-back ball games, and it's just because Josh Dobbs spreads it around so much. That and TJ Hockenson out there soaking up all the leftovers and not leaving any for Jordan Addison. But now a matchup going up against Denver. They allow 26.1 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 20th in the league. This Denver defense is no longer some pushover that you're going to go out and put up crazy numbers against. They're playing a lot better. Now at this time, KJ Osborne and Alexander Mattison are still both questionable to play in this ball game. If they're not active and we don't have Jefferson, we could see decent volume once again going the way of Jordan Addison. But at one point, Addison was up inside the top 12 overall wide receivers in fantasy football. Now, we kind of need to look at him as more of a flex option weekly at best. Maybe more of a top 25 to 30 wide receiver and not a top 12 wide receiver. But once Justin Jefferson comes back, may not be good for Jordan Addison because I have a feeling that Josh Dobbs is going to love throwing the ball to Justin Jefferson. But now, in the meantime, Addison's the only guy I'm considering in Minnesota until we get more word on JJ. How about Denver? Courtland Sutton is really the only guy I care about. And I said this maybe a few weeks ago now. Could you imagine the season that Courtland Sutton could be having if he saw 10 targets a week? Right now, he's averaging only 6 targets a game, and he's the current wide receiver 23 overall. And a lot of that is because of touchdowns. He has touchdowns now in 7 of the 9 games he's played this season, but only 2 games all year with at least 10 targets. In those 2 games, though, he caught over 70% of his passes. The guy could be having a huge top 12 type season if they just gave him more volume. But like I said, there is no one else remotely. I don't care about Jerry Jeudy right now in fantasy football. It's Courtland Sutton or nobody in Denver, and it's really because Russ is playing a lot better as well. But now a matchup going up against Minnesota, they allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they are much easier to throw on than they are to run on. Sutton has to become a weekly option for us here, especially in decent matchups like this one. He just finds a way to score fantasy points. Sure, he's a little touchdown dependent, but his chances of getting touchdown looks each and every week are like a mile high. See what I did there? Which only leaves us Monday Night Football, a rematch of last year's Super Bowl, Philadelphia and Kansas City. And for Philly, I know it's basically a no-brainer start each and every week for A.J. Brown. We really don't need to discuss that, but you do need to know this is no cream puff matchup for him. This Kansas City defense, especially against the pass, is really, really good. But what about Devontae Smith? He could thrive, right, with no Dallas Goedert? I mean, he's really going to have the opportunity, but if it's a tough matchup for A.J. Brown, it's got to be a tough matchup for Devontae Smith as well. This isn't the type of matchup where we can go into it expecting huge production. Now, on the other hand, when these two teams tend to face off, a lot of scoring tends to happen, and defense can kind of go out the window. On the season, Kansas City, though, is allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They're coming off the bye week, and they're healthy, though, in Philadelphia. They had an extra week to prep for this game. When I look at both these wide receivers, I really look at them as top 24 options this week. Sure, A.J. Brown going to be a lot higher than Devontae Smith. But both these guys may find themselves a couple spots lower in my rankings, but I desperately do want to take advantage of Devontae Smith here while we have no Dallas Goedert in the lineup. Philadelphia, they're going to need to score some points in this ball game. Let's hope for some skinny Batman in our lineups. What about for Kansas City? And just because they're coming off the bye week doesn't mean I've changed my stance on Kansas City at all. Rashee Rice is the only guy I'm considering, and honestly, I don't even feel safe about him, but he will be the highest ranked wide receiver here in Kansas City once again. He does have touchdowns now in 3 of his last 5 games, but he hasn't had over 75 yards in a game yet this season. Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney, MVS, any other mid wide receiver that Kansas City has on the roster, they're not an option for me, even though I will say this, more of a gut feeling, nothing to back this up. This does kind of feel like one of those games where we could get a couple deep shots down the field to MVS. Just throwing it out there, but still a huge risk. Now, this matchup going up against Philadelphia, they are so much easier to throw on than they are to run on. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Teams are having to keep pace with them and try to catch up against them each and every week. Now, this is a Monday Night Football game, primetime football, a Super Bowl rematch. two teams coming off their bye week with an extra week to prep for each other. This could lead to a whole lot of offense if I'm being completely honest. But even with that being said, I'm not going anywhere except for Rashee Rice, and even he may only barely squeak into my top 30. All right, that's going to do it for my wide receiver start and sit video here for Week 11 fantasy football. A ton of guys that we went through here today, and you have a ton of options for your fantasy lineups as well. Hopefully, I was able to give you a little bit of information to make some of your decisions a little bit easier. If you have tons of wide receivers that you're trying to decide between, don't worry. Our ranking show will be out Thursday morning to give you all that last-minute information you need to make those lineup decisions. I'm going to get out of here for the day, though. Hopefully, you enjoy the rest of your day and then do your part to make the world a better place.